There had never been an empire like this. By 1274, the Mongol Empire had already crushed China, Persia, and much of Eastern Europe. Entire civilizations had disappeared under its advance. Cities burnt. Those armies shattered. No force on earth had been able to stop it. And then, for the first time in its history, the empire made a mistake so small it almost looked like confidence. It underestimated an island. The letter arrived not as diplomacy, but as inevitability. Japan was not asked to negotiate. It was told to submit. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the largest continuous land empire in human history, did not bargain. He declared outcomes. The message was simple: surrender completely, or face complete destruction. The Japanese response took months, but when it came, it was unmistakable. The Mongol envoys were executed, their heads sent back across the sea as the official reply. Somewhere far away, Kublai Khan held that message in his hands, and in that moment, the fate of Japan was sealed not as a territory to be conquered, but as an example to be erased. What the empire built in response had no precedent. 900 ships, 40,000 veteran soldiers, men who had fought across continents, engineers who understood gunpowder not as curiosity, but as weapon. This was not an expedition. It was a verdict already written, now being delivered. From the shores of Hakata Bay, Japanese lookouts watched the horizon change. Not slowly, not subtly. The sea itself darkened with sails. This was not a storm. This was something far worse. It was the physical form of empire moving toward them. And the men who stood waiting on that shore believed they understood war. They were samurai. They followed a code, so rigid it defined not just how they fought, but who they were. Before battle, a warrior would step forward, announce his name, his lineage, his victories, and challenge an equal opponent. War, to them, was not chaos. It was structure, identity, honor made visible. So, when the first samurai rode forward and declared themselves to the Mongol lines, they expected a response. What they received instead was silence, then drums. Behind the drums came formations, tight, disciplined, unbroken. And behind those formations came something the samurai had never faced before. Thousands of arrows released at once, cutting through the air in coordinated waves. There was no duel, no acknowledgement, no honor. Only impact. The logic of their world collapsed in seconds. And then came the explosions. Iron spheres filled with gunpowder and metal fragments burst above them, tearing through formations, shattering horses, breaking minds. The sound alone was enough to disorient seasoned warriors. This was not just physical warfare. It was psychological, systematic, designed not to fight individuals, but to erase them. The battlefield at Hakata became something the samurai had never trained for. Their entire system built over generations for one-on-one combat, for honor, for recognition was suddenly irrelevant. Against a machine where every soldier was replaceable, where identity meant nothing, where victory was calculated, not earned, their code became a weakness. And by the end of that first day, the realization was unavoidable. If they continued to fight with honor, they would die with it. That night, something changed. There is no official record of the decision. There wouldn't be, because what happened next required abandoning everything the samurai had sworn to be. Bushido was not a tactic. It was identity. To break it was to become something else entirely. But survival leaves little room for identity. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, without ceremony, without witnesses, the samurai made a choice that would redefine warfare itself. They would stop fighting as samurai and become something the Mongol Empire did not understand. By day, the samurai were visible. Armor lacquered in color, crests marking lineage, names shouted into the open air. By night, they became the opposite. Dart, glow, silent movement. Faces, then weapons changed. Long ceremonial blades replaced with short daggers designed for close, quiet killing. And over their faces, some wore masks. Not for protection. For something else. Demon-like expressions carved in iron teeth bare. Ice. Hollow. Frozen in permanent rage. These were not decorations. They were the first deliberate use of psychological warfare against an empire that had never experienced fear from its enemies. The strategy was simple. Small groups, 5 to 12 men. No torches, no voices. Small boats drifting across the black surface of Hakata Bay. The Mongol fleet, anchored offshore, believed itself safe. Thousands of soldiers slept packed into ships designed for transport, not defense. The samurai moved through the water like shadows. They climbed silently. And then they disappeared inside the ships. What happened in those nights was never fully recorded. Not because it didn't happen, but because no one wanted to describe it. What we do know comes from fragments, reports, evidence, effects. Soldiers waking to find men missing. No struggle, no noise. Supplies burned from within, ropes cut cleanly, ships drifting, and on the wooden interiors of several vessels, marks carved into the surface. Symbols, clan, INSIGNIAS. Signatures. The samurai wanted the empire to know who had been there. For the first time in its expansion, the Mongol Empire encountered something it could not classify. Not an army, not a rebellion. Something else. Something that turned certainty into doubt. The effect was immediate. Soldiers stopped sleeping. Guards doubled. Then tripled. Not by order, but by instinct. The sea, once their greatest advantage, became a place of uncertainty. A place where something unseen could reach them at any time. The empire that had conquered continents had no doctrine for this. And for the first time, it hesitated. Kublai Khan did not see defeat. He saw interruption. The first invasion had not failed in his mind. It had simply been cut short by conditions beyond calculation. Weather, timing, variables to be corrected. And so, for 7 years, the empire prepared a response, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a fleet, but an armada. Not an invasion, but an occupation. 140,000 soldiers, over 4,000 ships. Supplies calculated not for battle, but for control. This time, Japan would not be tested. It would be erased. But while the empire built its answer, the samurai rebuilt themselves. They did not return to the old code. They could not. Once broken, it does not reform the same way. What replaced it was something quieter, harder, more dangerous. They learned from what nearly destroyed them. They studied the shoreline, the currents, the landing points, and along the coast of Hakata, they built something the Mongols had not anticipated. A wall, stone, 2 meters high, stretching 4 kilometers along the only viable landing zones. It was not a symbol. It was a refusal. A line that said, "Not one step further." When the second Mongol fleet arrived in 1281, it found something impossible. The largest naval force in history, unable to land. 4 weeks. The two sides existed in a tension that history rarely records because it is not dramatic enough to fit into simple narratives. No immediate battle. No decisive clash. Just pressure. Endless pressure. The Mongols attempted landings at multiple points. Each time, they were met with resistance that did not break, did not retreat, did not negotiate. The samurai no longer fought for honor. They fought for endurance. Every meter of shoreline became a point of conflict. Every attempt to step onto land was answered immediately, violently, without pause. The Mongol war machine had been designed for momentum, for sweeping movement across open land, for overwhelming force applied quickly and decisively. What it encountered in Japan was the opposite. Friction, resistance that did not collapse, time stretching longer than expected than time, was something the Empire had not accounted for. The ships had been built quickly, too quickly. Korean shipyards, pushed beyond capacity, forced to produce thousands of vessels under impossible deadlines. On the surface, they were massive, impressive. But beneath that, they carried a flaw. Structural weakness. Holes without the internal reinforcement needed to withstand sustained lateral pressure. They were built for speed of construction, not durability. For weeks, they remained anchored. For weeks, the samurai continued their attacks, night after night. Small boats slipping through darkness, boarding, burning, killing, leaving marks behind. The Mongol soldiers did not face an army they could engage. They faced something that never fully appeared, something that turned the night into an extension of the battlefield. Fatigue set in. Sleep became fragmented. Fear became constant. The ocean, once a shield, became a threat. And then the storm came. It was not unusual, not rare. Typhoons were a known part of the region. Seasonal, predictable in a general sense. But what matters in history is not the existence of an event. It is the moment it arrives. In August 1281, the typhoon struck. Winds howled across Hakata Bay. Waves rose 12 meters, crashing into ships that had no capacity to endure that level of force. Anchors snapped. Hulls collided. Vessels driven into each other, into the shore, into destruction. The bay itself became a trap, amplifying the energy of the storm, turning it into something far more violent than open sea. The fleet did not sink slowly. It collapsed. Chain by chain, ship B, ship. Thousands of vessels breaking apart under pressure they were never built to survive. Soldiers thrown into water they could not navigate, armor dragging them down, wood splintering, fire spreading where it could, chaos without command. There are estimates that over 100,000 men did not return, the largest invasion force ever assembled, erased in a single night. When the storm passed, the sea did not look like water anymore. It looked like wreckage. Broken ships, floating bodies, fragments of an empire scattered across the surface. Beneath it, the remains sank, layer upon layer, forming a graveyard that would not be fully understood for centuries. The samurai did not claim victory in the way we imagine. There was no celebration recorded, no grand declaration, because what happened did not fit into the framework they had once lived by. This was not honor. This was survival. And survival, when it comes at that scale, leaves something behind. Kublai Khan considered a third invasion. He wanted to continue, to finish what had been interrupted twice. But this time something had changed, not in Japan, but within the empire itself. The cost was too high. The losses too severe. The logistics too unstable. His advisors resisted. His generals hesitated. And eventually, the plan dissolved not through defeat, but through exhaustion. Japan would never be invaded again by a continental empire for centuries, and the men who defended it were no longer the same. They had started as warriors bound by honor so rigid it defined their existence. They had ended as something else entirely. Fighters who understood that survival sometimes requires abandoning the very identity that defines you, that rules can become weaknesses, that systems can collapse when faced with something they were never designed to handle. History would later give the storm a name. Kamikaze. Divine Wind. But that name hides something important. The storm did not win the war. The Empire was already breaking. Weeks of pressure, nights without rest. Ships weakened, soldiers destabilized. The typhoon did not defeat the Mongol Empire. It finished what had already begun. And that is the part history rarely tells. Because it is easier to believe in miracles than to understand adaptation. It is easier to say the gods intervenit, than to accept that the most powerful empire in history was undone by something it could not recognize. Not strength, not numbers, but change. The samurai did not defeat the Mongols by being stronger. They defeated them by becoming unrecognizable, and somewhere beneath the waters of Hakata Bay, the remains of that realization still exist. Wood, iron, bone preserved in silence, evidence of a moment when certainty met something it could not control. Empires fall in many ways. Sometimes through war, sometimes through time, and sometimes through a single mistake. Underestimating something that refuses to disappear.